My father said you needed a wife." She stood on his porch, holding nothing but a worn leather suitcase and a dead man's letter, and Ethan Walker hadn't spoken a word in 3 days, until that moment cracked him open like dry earth after the first rain. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end. Leave a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this story has traveled. The letter arrived before she did. It came on a Tuesday, tucked inside a bundle of feed invoices that Ethan's ranch hand, a quiet older man named Pete Dobbins, had picked up from the post office in Millhaven. Pete left the mail on the kitchen table without a word, the way he always did, and Ethan might not have noticed it until the following morning if the envelope hadn't been sealed with red wax pressed in the shape of an H, Samuel Harper's mark. Ethan stood over the table for a long moment without picking it up. He recognized the handwriting immediately. The wide looping letters. The ink pressed too hard into the paper, because Samuel always wrote like a man trying to make sure the words wouldn't disappear. He had seen that handwriting on cattle manifests and supply orders, and once a long time ago on a note that simply read, "Stay down, I've got him," which Samuel had pressed into Ethan's hand during the worst night of Ethan's life. He picked up the letter. He did not open it. He set it on the windowsill and went back out to finish mending the east fence line, because the cattle had broken through again, and because some things were easier to face after you'd exhausted yourself with your hands. He worked until the sun dropped behind the ridge, and the temperature fell fast, the way it always did in Montana in September. And then he came back inside and washed up and stood in front of the windowsill again. The letter hadn't moved. He opened it. Samuel Harper's handwriting filled 2 pages, and by the end of the first paragraph, Ethan already knew Samuel was dead. Not because Samuel said so directly, that wasn't his way, but because the letter read like a man finishing his business. Deliberate. Measured. Every sentence placed with the quiet certainty of someone who knows he won't get a chance to clarify later. "I have been ill for some time," Samuel wrote. "Longer than I told most people. You know how that goes, Ethan. You of all people understand that some things are easier to carry quietly." Ethan set the letter down. He pressed his hand flat against the table. He breathed once slowly. Then he picked it up and kept reading. Samuel explained that he had died. He wrote it plainly in past tense, as if he had already stepped outside of time, and that his affairs were in poor shape. The debts were real. The house would have to go. His daughter Lillian was 25 years old and capable and proud. Samuel wrote the kind of proud that would make her refuse help even when she needed it desperately, which meant that anyone who wanted to help her would have to approach the matter very carefully. "She doesn't know I'm writing this," Samuel continued. "She would argue with me about it. But she'll come to you, Ethan. I've asked her to. Not because she needs rescuing, I want to be clear about that, but because I am asking you as the man I trust more than any other living person to give her a fair chance. Show her the same respect you showed me when we first met, and I was nothing but a broke drover who didn't know north from south. You needed me then. And I think you still need someone, even if you've spent the last several years convincing yourself otherwise. Look after my daughter. And for God's sake, Ethan, let her look after you too." The letter ended there. Ethan folded it carefully along its original creases and set it back in the envelope. He walked to the fireplace, and for one long moment, he stood holding the envelope over the flames. Not because he wanted to destroy it, but because holding something that close to fire felt like the right way to mark grief when you didn't have any other ritual left. Then he set the envelope on the mantel and went to bed. He lay awake most of the night. Samuel Harper had saved his life in 1874 during a cattle drive along the Yellowstone when a storm pushed the herd into a panic and Ethan's horse went down in the chaos and 3,000 pounds of frightened cattle were bearing down on a man pinned beneath a broken animal in the dark and the mud. Samuel pulled him out. Samuel took a broken rib for the effort. Samuel never once mentioned it afterward, except to say once quietly on a clear night 3 days later, "You'd have done the same for me." Ethan wasn't sure that was true. He liked to think it was. He had spent most of the past 7 years not thinking about Samuel Harper at all, because thinking about the people you were grateful to always carried the risk of realizing how long it had been since you'd seen them. And by the time you noticed the length of that silence, it was usually too late to do anything about it. Now, it was too late. Samuel was dead, and his daughter was coming, and Ethan had approximately 2 days to figure out what he was going to say to her. He decided he would be honest. He decided he would tell her that he had no idea what her father was thinking, that the ranch was not much to look at, that he was not easy to be around, and that whatever Samuel had imagined for her, Ethan was probably not the right answer. He fell asleep rehearsing those words. He woke up and started the morning chores. She arrived on the 3rd day. Ethan was in the middle of arguing with Pete Dobbins about whether the North Water Trough needed to be replaced entirely or just reinforced. Pete believed in reinforcement. Ethan believed in replacing things before they failed completely, and this was an argument they had approximately once a month without resolution when he heard wheels on the road. He turned. The wagon from Millhaven rolled to a stop at his gate. The driver, a heavy-set man named Collins who ran the general freight route, climbed down from the box and unloaded a small trunk and a leather suitcase, and tipped his hat and drove away without a word, because Collins was a man who understood that some deliveries required discretion. The woman standing beside the luggage was not what Ethan expected. I was not sure what he expected. Samuel had shown him a photograph once years ago of a girl, maybe 12 or 13 years old, standing beside her mother in front of a clapboard house, squinting into the sun. He had carried some vague version of that image into adulthood without thinking much about it. The woman at his gate bore almost no resemblance to that photograph. She was tall, with dark hair pinned up beneath a practical hat, and she was wearing a traveling dress that had clearly seen better days. Clean, but worn at the cuffs and hem. The fabric faded in a way that spoke of many washings and careful maintenance. She stood straight. Her chin was up. She was holding a suitcase in one hand and a sealed envelope in the other, and she was looking at Ethan with an expression that was entirely composed, except for a tightness around her eyes that suggested she had been composing herself very deliberately for some time now. Ethan walked to the gate. He opened it. She stepped through. And then she said it quietly and without preamble, the way a person delivers news they've been rehearsing. "My father said you needed a wife." Ethan stopped. Pete Dobbins behind him made no sound at all. Ethan looked at the envelope in her hand. He looked at her face. He had been prepared for grief, for questions, for a young woman in distress who needed help and would need careful handling and would probably cry and would probably make him feel inadequate in approximately 17 different ways. He had not been prepared for those 7 words delivered with that particular combination of exhaustion and dignity. He said after a long moment, "Did he tell you why?" Lillian Harper held the envelope a little tighter. Her jaw shifted slightly, not quite a tremble, not quite controlled, something between the two. "He said," she answered, "that you were the kind of man who could build a house, but you forgot how to make it a home." The wind moved through the grass around them. Somewhere in the south pasture, one of the cattle lowed. Ethan stood in the gate of his own property and felt for the first time in years entirely uncertain what to do next. He stepped back. He gestured toward the porch. "Come inside," he said. "I'll make coffee." It was not eloquent. It was not the measured, honest speech he had rehearsed. But it was what came out, and Lillian nodded once and picked up her suitcase and followed him up the path. And that was how it began. She sat at his kitchen table and told him the whole truth without flinching. The debts had been worse than anyone knew. Her father had borrowed against the property twice in the years after her mother died, trying to keep the farm operational and paying for a doctor who came out from Billings twice a month for the last year and a half. The farm was sold at auction 3 weeks after Samuel's funeral. She'd been staying with a neighboring family, the Caldwells. Not the pleasant kind of neighbors, she said, with a precise flatness in her voice that told Ethan there was more to that story, and it had become apparent very quickly that she could not remain there. "He left me the letter 6 months ago," she said, "when he first understood he wasn't going to recover. He made me promise that if things became difficult, I would come to you." She paused. "He said you were a man of your word. He said you wouldn't turn me away." "I won't," Ethan said. "I'm not here asking for charity." "I didn't think you were. I have skills," she continued, and her voice was level factual, like someone presenting a business case. "I kept my father's books for 4 years. I managed the household accounts, the crop planning, the seasonal labor schedules. I can sew, cook, preserve, and I'm not afraid of hard work. I'm not asking to be taken care of. I'm asking for the opportunity to be useful." Ethan looked at her across the table. She looked back at him. "What exactly did your father suggest?" he asked. A beat of silence. "He suggested marriage," she said. "He said it would give me legal standing and protection. He said you would understand the practical value of the arrangement." Another beat. "He also said you would probably argue about it for a week before agreeing." Despite everything, Ethan almost smiled. He wasn't wrong about that, he said. He got up and poured more coffee. He didn't need, and stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the yard, at the fence line at the barn that needed new siding on the east wall. At the whole modest, functional, deeply impersonal kingdom he had assembled for himself out of stubbornness and grief and the dogged refusal to need anyone. Samuel Harper had looked at this life from the outside, from the distance of a letter, from the vantage point of a man who knew death was coming and wanted to settle things, and had decided that Ethan needed a wife. Ethan wasn't sure if he was insulted or grateful. He thought probably both. "I'm going to be honest with you," he said, turning back. "Please," Lillian said. "I haven't had another person in this house regularly in almost 6 years. I don't know how to do this. I'm not warm by nature. I work long hours, and I'm not easy company, and I have a tendency to go silent for days at a time without explanation." "My father warned me," she said. "Did he?" He said, and I'm quoting directly, "Ethan Walker is the best man I know, and also the most aggravating. You'll want to argue with him constantly, and you'll be right about half the time, and he'll be right about the other half, and neither of you will admit it." This time Ethan did smile briefly, and it changed his face entirely for a moment, opened something up that was usually closed. "That sounds like him," he said. "It does." They both sat with that for a moment, with the particular silence that follows. The first time two people acknowledge grief at the same time. Then Ethan sat back down. "Here's what I can offer," he said. "You can stay here. You'll have your own space. You'll be safe, and you'll be fed, and you'll have work that matters. If you want to manage the household accounts and the records, that would genuinely help, because mine are in a state that Samuel would have been embarrassed by." He paused. "The marriage, if that's what makes sense legally to protect you, I'm not opposed. But I want you to understand something clearly." He looked at her directly. "No one will own you in this house. Not me, not anyone. You don't owe me obedience or gratitude or anything except honest dealing. You leave whenever you decide to leave, and I'll help you get wherever you're going. That's my word." Lillian Harper looked at him for a long moment. He watched her absorb it, watched something shift in her expression, not dramatically, but in the small and specific way that a person's face changes when they've been expecting one thing and received something entirely different. "My father said you'd say something like that," she said quietly. "Did he?" "He said you were the kind of man who offers people their dignity before they have a chance to ask for it." Ethan didn't know what to say to that. He picked up his coffee cup. It was empty. "I'll show you your room," he said. Pete Dobbins found out about the arrangement at breakfast the next morning and responded with 2 minutes of total silence, followed by a single question. "She's staying permanent." "That's not decided yet," Ethan said. Pete nodded once and went back to his eggs and did not say another word on the subject for 3 days, which was for Pete an extraordinary demonstration of restraint. The town of Millhaven found out about it by the end of the week. Ethan drove in for supplies on Friday morning and could tell immediately from the way the conversation at the general store died when he walked in that the news had traveled faster than he had. Frank Dutton, who ran the store, managed a neutral expression for approximately 45 seconds before he couldn't help himself. "Heard you've got Samuel Harper's daughter staying out at your place," Frank said. "That's right," Ethan said. "Long term. We're working that out." Frank leaned on the counter with the studied casualness of a man who is desperate to ask the next question. "People are going to talk, you know. A single woman out there alone with—" "Then we'll get married," Ethan said, because it was easier than the alternative, and because Samuel had been right that it was the practical solution, and he loaded his supplies and left before Frank could find a follow-up question. He told Lillian that evening. She was at the kitchen table with his account ledgers spread out around her, and an expression on her face that told him she'd found what she was looking for, and it wasn't good news. "Married," she repeated without looking up from the ledger. "For appearances, and legal protection." "I know what it's for." She turned a page. "Ethan, your account with the Millhaven Grain Co. is 4 months behind." He sat down across from her. "I know. And you owe the Hendersons for the fence materials from last spring." "I know that too. You're not broke, but you're close to the edge." She looked up. "I can fix this." "I know you can." She studied him. "You're not defensive about it." "Being defensive about the truth doesn't change it." Something shifted in her expression, the same small movement he'd seen the first day the recalibration. "All right," she said. "Then yes to the marriage, on your terms." She went back to the ledger. "And I want full access to all the ranch accounts going forward. Every one of them." "Done," he said. "And I want to be consulted on major purchases." "Agreed." She looked up again. "You agreed very quickly. You're clearly better at this than I am." Lillian looked at him for a moment, and for the first time she smiled. Not the composed, carefully constructed expression she'd worn since she arrived, but a real one, brief and a little surprised, as if it had gotten through her defenses before she could stop it. "Your father sent you to the right place," Ethan said. "Don't tell him that," she said. He was already insufferably sure of himself. And then she went back to the ledger, and Ethan watched her work, and the kitchen felt different than it had the evening before. Not warmer exactly, not safer, but fuller somehow, as if something that had been missing without his knowledge had quietly returned. The marriage took place on a Thursday in the office of Judge Harlan Beecham, who had married approximately 300 couples over his 30-year tenure, and approached each ceremony with the same brisk, businesslike efficiency, regardless of the circumstances. Lillian wore her second-best dress. Ethan wore the good shirt he normally reserved for funerals. Pete Dobbins stood as witness because there was nobody else practical to ask, and because Pete, when pressed, had said simply, "I'm not opposed." The ceremony took 11 minutes. Walking back to the wagon afterward, Lillian said, "He didn't even ask if we loved each other." "He asked if we were consenting," Ethan said. "That's considerably more practical." Beecham's a practical man. They rode back to the ranch in a silence that was not quite comfortable and not quite awkward. The specific silence of two strangers who have just done something irrevocable and are still deciding how they feel about it. When they got back, Pete had killed a chicken and made a stew. Ethan ate 2 bowls of it and didn't say much, and Lillian ate 1 bowl and reorganized the kitchen cabinet while the stew was still cooling, which Pete watched with an expression of deep philosophical interest, and that was the wedding reception. In the weeks that followed, Ethan learned things. He learned that Lillian woke before dawn and was usually already working by the time he came in for breakfast. He learned that she reorganized things without asking first, but always with a logic that made the reorganized version obviously better than the original. He learned that she argued clearly and without heat. She laid out her position and her reasons, and then listened to his with a focused attention that was both flattering and slightly intimidating. He learned that she had nightmares sometimes. He didn't ask about them, but he heard her on 2 occasions, moving around in her room in the deep middle of the night, and once he heard her outside on the porch in the cold dark, talking quietly to no one, which was a thing he recognized because he had done it himself for years after the hard winter took everything. He learned that she had left something behind at the Caldwell farm. Not possessions, she didn't seem especially attached to possessions, but there was something she never quite said. Something in the way the flatness returned to her voice whenever the name Caldwell came up that told him the story of her weeks. There was worse than the efficient summary she'd given him at his kitchen table. He didn't push. He waited. On a Saturday evening. Near the end of September, they were sitting on the porch after supper, Ethan with his coffee, Lillian with a letter she was writing to a friend back east, when the sound of hoofbeats on the road made Ethan set down his cup. 3 riders. They pulled up at the gate. The one in front was a man Ethan recognized. Douglas Caldwell, 23 years old, the eldest son of Victor Caldwell, who owned the biggest spread in the valley. Douglas was broad and well-fed, and wore his money in the particular way of people who have always had it casually, unconsciously, as if wealth were a natural condition of the universe, and its absence in others simply an oversight. Douglas looked from Ethan to Lillian. His gaze landed on Lillian and stayed there. "Mrs. Walker," he said, and the way he said it, the faint amused stress on the name, the slight smile told Ethan everything he needed to know about why these writers were here at this hour. Lillian did not look up from her letter. "Douglas," she said in the specific tone of a woman who is choosing not to acknowledge a tone. "Didn't expect to find you still here," Douglas said. "Thought you'd be moving on by now." "Did you?" she said. "Our offer stands, you know. My father said he'd be happy to give you work if—" "I have work," Lillian said. She finished the line she was writing and looked up. "And a home, and a husband. So your father's offer is unnecessary, but please thank him for his concern." Douglas's smile didn't change, but something behind it did. His eyes moved to Ethan. "Walker," he said, "you should know my father's going to want to talk to you soon, about the East Water access." "He knows where to find me," Ethan said. "He does." Douglas held Ethan's gaze for a moment with the practiced ease of a man who has spent his life using his father's money as leverage and knows exactly how much weight it carries. "Evening." He turned his horse. The two riders with him followed. They were gone in less than a minute. The quiet returned to the porch. Lillian put her pen down and looked at her letter for a moment without reading it. "What happened at this Caldwell farm?" Ethan said. It wasn't a question quite, not a demand. It was offered like a door left open. Lillian was quiet for a moment. "Victor Caldwell told me 3 days after my father's funeral that my situation was precarious and that he was willing to help me for certain considerations." She kept her eyes on the letter. "When I declined, his son Douglas decided I had misunderstood the nature of the offer and required clarification." A pause. "I left the following morning." Ethan looked at the road where the riders had disappeared. He thought several things. He said only, "You're safe here." "I know," Lillian said. She picked up her pen. "I wouldn't have stayed if I didn't." He looked at her. She began writing her letter again, her handwriting steady, her posture straight. And Ethan Walker, who had spent 7 years learning how to carry everything alone, felt the very particular weight of a man who has just understood that the person sitting next to him has been carrying something just as heavy for much longer, and that the right response is not to take it from her, but to sit close enough that she doesn't have to carry it alone. He picked up his coffee. He didn't say anything else. The wind moved across the porch. The stars came out over Montana. And somewhere in the distance on the road that ran between Ethan's modest ranch and the biggest spread in the valley, Douglas Caldwell rode home to his father, and whatever was coming was already in motion. Victor Caldwell did not come himself. That was the first thing Ethan noticed. When a man sends a messenger instead of coming in person, it means one of two things. Either he doesn't consider you worth his time, or he considers you dangerous enough to approach carefully. Given everything Ethan knew about Victor Caldwell, he suspected it was the former wearing the costume of the latter. The messenger was a lawyer named Gerald Pruitt, who rode out from Millhaven on a Monday morning dressed in a suit that cost more than most men in the valley earned in a month. He carried a leather satchel and a smile that had been assembled rather than grown. The kind of smile that exists to occupy the lower half of a face while the eyes do the actual work. Ethan met him in the yard. Pete Dobbins stayed near the barn and pretended to repair something. "Mr. Walker," Pruitt said, climbing down from his horse with the careful movements of a man unaccustomed to riding. "I represent Victor Caldwell in matters of property and land agreement. Mr. Caldwell has asked me to convey his regards and to discuss a matter of mutual interest regarding the eastern boundary of your property." "His regards," Ethan repeated. "Indeed." He could have brought those himself. Pruitt's smile did not waver. "Mr. Caldwell is a busy man. He hoped you would understand." Ethan looked at the satchel. He had a good sense of what was inside it. He'd been expecting something like this since Douglas and his riders had shown up on the porch. He had just expected it to take longer. "Come inside," he said. Lillian was at the table when they entered, the account ledgers open in front of her, a cup of coffee at her elbow. She looked up when they came in and registered Pruitt with a quick, precise glance that took in the suit, the satchel, and the manufactured smile in approximately 1 second. She did not leave. Pruitt glanced at her and then back at Ethan with a barely perceptible hesitation that asked without words whether they should speak privately. "My wife handles our accounts," Ethan said. "Whatever you've come to discuss is her business too." Another flicker behind Pruitt's eyes. He covered it smoothly. "Of course." He sat down and opened the satchel and produced a folded document, which he laid on the table with the practiced care of a man placing a card in a game he believes he's already won. "Mr. Caldwell is prepared to make a generous offer for the eastern 40 acres of your property, specifically the parcel that encompasses the creek and the access route to the Henderson Flats. He's offering $120 per acre, which is considerably above current market value." Ethan looked at the document without touching it. $120 an acre was generous. He knew exactly what the market rate was, and he knew exactly why Victor Caldwell would offer almost double it. That eastern parcel was the only route to the Henderson Flats that didn't cross Caldwell's existing land. Without it, every small rancher in the Eastern Valley had to ask Caldwell's permission to move cattle or access the seasonal water. Caldwell had been maneuvering toward control of that corridor for years. He just hadn't found a way to get Ethan Walker to sell. "No," Ethan said. Pruitt nodded as if this were expected. "Mr. Caldwell anticipated some hesitation. He wanted me to convey that the offer will remain open for 30 days, and that he's also prepared to discuss flexible payment arrangements if the lump sum presents any difficulty." "It doesn't," Lillian said. Both men looked at her. She was looking at Pruitt with the same focused attention she gave the account ledgers, precise without hostility and entirely unintimidated. "The eastern parcel is not for sale," she said. "Not at 120, not at 200, not at any price. It's access to that parcel that makes this ranch viable for the next 20 years, and Mr. Caldwell is aware of that fact, which is presumably why he's willing to pay above market." She paused. "Please thank him for his interest." Pruitt looked at her for a moment with an expression that was trying very hard to be pleasant and was succeeding less and less with each passing second. "Mrs. Walker," he said carefully, "perhaps it might be worth—" "My wife said no," Ethan said. "So did I. That's 2 no's. You need a different number than that." Pruitt gathered his document and replaced it in the satchel with the slow movements of a man recalibrating his approach. "I'll convey your response," he said. "Mr. Caldwell may wish to revisit the conversation in the future." "He knows where to find us," Ethan said, after Pruitt left. Pete Dobbins came in from the barn and helped himself to coffee without asking, which meant he'd been listening from close enough to hear everything. "Caldwell's moving," Pete said. "He's been moving," Ethan said. "We just didn't see it clearly until now." Lillian was already looking at the land documents she'd pulled from Ethan's records 2 weeks earlier, the original property surveys, the deed records, the water rights filings. She'd organized them into a folder that she'd labeled in her precise handwriting and placed in the wooden crate she'd designated as the ranch's official record system, which was a considerable improvement over Ethan's previous system, which was a drawer that also contained 3 horseshoe nails and a broken pocket watch. "I wants the water," she said. "Not just the access. He wants to control the water source." "I know," Ethan said. "If he controls the creek head, he controls who gets water in a dry year." She looked up. "There are 6 other families that depend on that creek besides you." "I know that too." She looked at him steadily. "Does he know we know?" "He suspects," Ethan said. "He wouldn't have sent a lawyer. He'd have come himself." Pete drank his coffee. "What are we going to do?" Ethan looked at Lillian. She was already looking at the deed. "We're going to find out," she said, "exactly what we own and exactly what he doesn't." That was how the research began. It started as an evening activity. Lillian working through the land records after supper, while Ethan finished the end-of-day accounts she'd shown him how to maintain properly. Pete occasionally contributing a memory about where this boundary marker had been or who had witnessed that survey. But within 2 weeks, it had become something larger. Lillian began writing letters to the county land office, to the territorial recorder's office in Helena, to a man she'd corresponded with years earlier, who worked as a surveyor and now consulted on land disputes. Ethan asked her one evening how she knew to do this. "My father had a dispute with a neighbor over a fence line when I was 17. She said, not looking up from the letter she was composing. "He didn't know anything about land law either. We figured it out together." She paused. "I read everything I could find about property rights and water access rights. I've been interested in it since." "You never studied it formally." "Women don't get to study law formally," she said in the tone of someone stating an obvious fact without particular bitterness. "But reading isn't formally required." He watched her write. "You're good at this," he said. She looked up briefly. "Don't sound so surprised." "I'm not surprised," he said. "I'm impressed. That's a different thing." She held his gaze for a moment, that same small recalibration, and then went back to the letter. The relationship between them was deepening in the way that relationships between capable people often do not, through declarations, not through dramatic moments, but through the accumulation of work done, side by side, of problems, shared and solved, of the gradual discovery that the person across the table from you is not who you expected and is in fact considerably more. Ethan had expected a woman in distress. He'd gotten a partner. I wasn't sure how to account for the difference. He wasn't sure he needed to. He just found himself increasingly looking forward to supper conversations and dreading the end of them. He found himself noticing small things: the way she tilted her head when she was thinking hard, the way she never gave up an argument without reason, but always gave it up graciously when the reason was sufficient, the way she laughed at things Pete said, with a warmth that was completely unguarded. He hadn't heard laughter in that kitchen in years. He hadn't known how much he missed it until it came back. The town of Millhaven took somewhat longer to adjust. Ethan had never been especially concerned with what Millhaven thought of him, but Lillian moved through the town with a different relationship to community than Ethan had ever developed. She shopped deliberately. She introduced herself. She asked questions and remembered answers. Within 3 weeks of her arrival, she knew the names of the Dutton children, the history of the Methodist Church's roof dispute, and which family in town was quietly struggling to afford enough flour for winter and would appreciate an extra sack left on the porch without commentary. Ethan watched her navigate the town with the same focused attention she gave the ledgers. "You're organizing them," he said on the ride back from Millhaven one afternoon. "People," she said. "Not organizing, just paying attention." She looked out across the flatlands. "People take care of the things they feel connected to. If we're going to need this community's support someday, it helps if they know we see them." He thought about that for the rest of the drive. "I thought, Samuel, you did not tell me nearly enough about your daughter." The first serious conflict came on a Tuesday in early October, 3 weeks after Pruitt's visit. Ethan was in the barn when Pete came in with a face that meant bad news was on its way. "4 of Caldwell's men just rode through the east pasture," Pete said. "The one that borders the creek access." Ethan set down what he was holding. "Doing what?" "Said they were checking a fence line, but they put a stake in the ground near the creek bank. Survey stake." Ethan walked out of the barn and looked east. He couldn't see the men from where he stood. They were too far, but he could see the dust their horses had kicked up drifting against the sky. "They're marking," he said. "That's what it looked like." He went inside and found Lillian. He told her in 2 sentences. She was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. The specific silence of a person absorbing information and rapidly sorting through its implications. "He's claiming the creek boundary is disputed," she said. "That's what the stake means." "Has anyone ever formally surveyed the eastern boundary?" "Not since my father's time. There should be a survey record from 1868. "Is it here?" he thought. "It should be in the county records. I never needed a copy because nobody ever disputed it." She was already at the record crate pulling the folder. "When did your father buy this property?" 1866. "And the deed was recorded in Millhaven before the county was reorganized in 74. She stopped. She looked at him. Something behind her eyes shifted. "Ethan," she said carefully, "when the county was reorganized in 1874, were all the pre-reorganization deed records transferred to the new county register?" He didn't know. He said so. That's the question, she said. Because if they weren't transferred completely, if any records were misfiled or lost, then Caldwell could argue that the original deed boundaries are unclear. He'd be lying, Ethan said. He doesn't have to lie if the records don't exist to contradict him. She set down the folder. We need to go to Millhaven, to the register's office. Today. The county register's office was operated by a meticulous and perpetually anxious man named Herbert Fitch, who had worked in the office for 18 years and who greeted Ethan's request for the 1868 survey records with the expression of a man being asked to retrieve something from a room he hasn't entered recently. After 40 minutes of searching, during which Lillian stood patiently at the counter and Ethan stood slightly less patiently, Herbert Fitch emerged from the back room with a document box, a considerable quantity of dust on his jacket, and the specific expression of a man who has found something he wasn't expecting to find. Here's the deed record, he said. But the survey. He paused. He opened another folder. He frowned. The survey record from '68 should be attached. He looked through the folder again. It's not here. Ethan felt the bottom of something drop away. Where would it be? Lillian asked, her voice perfectly steady. It should be here, Herbert said, frowning at the folder. When we transferred the pre-'74 records, everything should have come over together. But this file... He stopped. Someone's been through this box recently. The order's wrong. He said it as a professional observation without accusation, just a man noting that his careful organization had been disturbed. Ethan looked at Lillian. Lillian looked at the folder. Mr. Fitch, she said. Is there any other location where a copy of that survey might be filed? A backup record, a territorial filing. Herbert Fitch scratched the back of his neck. Territorial Land Office in Helena would have a copy of any survey that was submitted prior to '72, but that's a 2-week correspondence minimum. Then we should start the correspondence today, Lillian said. Herbert looked at her with the particular expression of a bureaucrat encountering someone who understands bureaucracy from the outside. Faintly surprised, cautiously approving. I'll draft the inquiry myself, he said. In the wagon on the way home, Ethan said, the survey record didn't walk out of that folder on its own. No, Lillian agreed. Caldwell, or someone working for Caldwell. She was thinking he could see it, the focused inward look. He's been planning this for a while. You don't remove a document on impulse. You remove it when you already know what you're going to do with the gap it leaves. He needs me off that land before the survey comes back from Helena. He needs the dispute to be established before the legitimate record surfaces, she corrected. Because once Helena confirms the original boundary, any claim he's made in the interim looks like what it is. So what does he do? He pressures. He files a formal dispute. He tries to get a preliminary ruling that leaves the boundary in question while everything is processed. And in the meantime, he controls the eastern access. She looked at him. Which affects the Henderson family, and the Bowers, and the Olsons. Those were names Ethan knew well. 3 families with small operations that depended on the creek corridor each autumn to move cattle down to the winter grazing. He's not just coming after me, Ethan said. No, he's coming after everyone who depends on you being here. She paused. Which means this isn't just your fight. The Henderson farm was 3 miles east. They stopped. Gus Henderson was a large man in his late 50s who had worked this land for 20 years and trusted Ethan Walker, the way you trust a man who has never given you reason not to. His wife Clara came out onto the porch when the wagon arrived, and their eldest son Thomas appeared from around the side of the barn with a hammer in his hand. Ethan told them plainly. The missing survey. The stake in the eastern pasture. What it likely meant for the creek corridor access come autumn. Gus Henderson listened with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and when Ethan finished he said, "That greedy son of a," and then glanced at Clara and stopped. "How do we fight it?" Thomas asked. He was 22 and direct. "My wife is working on it," Ethan said. 3 heads turned to Lillian, who was sitting beside Ethan with her hands folded and her expression calm. "We've started the process to get the original survey record from the territorial office in Helena," she said. "But that takes time. In the meantime, if Victor Caldwell files a formal boundary dispute, the county judge will review any supporting documentation both sides can provide. We need everything you have. Any letter, any deed reference, any record that mentions the creek access as established and acknowledged. Even a bill of sale that references the corridor by name would help. Clara Henderson said, I have a letter from Thomas's grandfather to my father-in-law. When they first started using the corridor back in '69, they wrote down the agreement. Lillian's eyes sharpened. That letter is extremely important. I'd like to see it. I can get it today, Clara said. They stayed another hour. Clara produced the letter, a simple, plainly written document between two ordinary men, noting that the corridor along Ethan's eastern pasture was the agreed route for seasonal cattle movement, and had been used as such since the Walker family settled the land. It had no legal formality, but it had a date and 2 signatures and the specific authority of plain-spoken truth. Lillian held it carefully with both hands. This, as she said, is exactly what we needed. The ride back was quiet. The sun was low and the shadows long across the grass, and the air had the particular clarity of a Montana autumn evening. Ethan said, You knew what you were looking for before we even got there. I hoped, she said. Correspondence between neighbors often captures boundary acknowledgments more accurately than formal documents, because ordinary people just write down what's true. He thought about that. He said, What you're doing, this isn't just bookkeeping. No, she agreed. Your father never mentioned you had this kind of mind. She was quiet for a moment. Then, my father thought I was going to marry a school teacher and spend my life in a pleasant house running a tidy household. She said it without bitterness, more like a woman describing a landscape she'd grown accustomed to not living in. He was a good man who had limited ideas about what his daughter was built for. He loved me. He just didn't quite see me. Ethan thought of Samuel Harper's letter. She doesn't know I'm writing this. She would argue with me about it. He had read that as a father who knew his daughter's pride. He was beginning to think it was also a father who didn't know his daughter's depth. I think, he said carefully, that when he wrote to me, he thought he was protecting you. I know, she said. But that's not the only thing that happened. She looked at him. He kept his eyes on the road. I think he was doing something else too. I think he was doing what he did in '74, putting the right 2 people in the same place at the right moment, and trusting that they'd figure out the rest on their own. He could feel her looking at him. That's a generous interpretation, she said. Maybe. He finally glanced over. But your father was a generous man. The silence after that was different from the silences before it, fuller, somehow like a room after a window has been opened. When they got back to the ranch, Pete had already fed the animals and started supper, because Pete's personal philosophy included the conviction that supper should never wait for other people's complicated days. He'd made cornbread, which he set on the table with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has contributed meaningfully and expects no recognition for it. Ethan told him about the missing survey and the Henderson letter over supper. Pete absorbed it and said, So Caldwell's had someone in that records office. Looks that way, Ethan said. Fitch won't know who, Pete said. But someone knows. Someone always knows, Lillian said. In a town this size, something like that doesn't happen without talk. Someone delivered that instruction. Someone carried it out. You think we can find out who? Ethan asked. I think, she said, that Frank Dutton at the general store knows most of what happens in this town before it happens. And I've been buying our supplies there for 5 weeks. Ethan looked at her. You've already been talking to him, he said. I've been letting him talk to me, she said. That's different. I mostly listen. And, she broke off a piece of Pete's cornbread. I'll know more by Friday. It was at this point that Ethan Walker, who had spent 7 years eating supper alone at this table, and finding the silence perfectly adequate, understood with total and slightly disorienting clarity that he had been wrong about that. Not a little wrong. Profoundly wrong in the specific way that a man can be wrong about something for so long that the wrongness becomes invisible, just the texture of daily life, unremarkable and assumed. He looked across the table at his wife, who was eating cornbread and already thinking about Friday, and he thought Samuel. You knew exactly what you were doing. He didn't say that. He said, "The cornbread's good, Pete." "I know it is," Petey said. And Lillian smiled without looking up, that real smile, the one that got through before she could stop it. And the kitchen held it like a warm room holds heat long after the fire has settled. By Friday, Lillian knew more. Frank Dutton hadn't told her anything directly. He was too canny for that, too practiced in the art of Millhaven's social navigation. But he'd mentioned in the course of what seemed like ordinary conversation about flower prices and the coming winter that Gerald Pruitt had been in the records office twice in the last month. And he'd mentioned, as a seemingly unconnected afterthought, that Herbert Fitch had received a new harness from the Caldwell operation last spring as a gift for services to the community, which Fitch had accepted with evident gratitude. Lillian brought this home on Friday evening and laid it on the table between them, like evidence. Ethan stared at it. "Fitch," he said. "I don't know that he removed the record himself," she said carefully. "He may simply have looked the other way when someone else did. Or he may have been shown where the record was stored and allowed access." She folded her hands. "But he knew. He knew, and he said nothing to us except that someone had disturbed his files." "Which is his way of telling us without telling us," Pete said. "Possibly." She looked at Ethan. "The question is, what we do with this." "We could confront Fitch," Ethan said. "And what does he deny he received a harness? He keeps disorganized records. He can't be held responsible for what he didn't observe." She shook her head. "Confronting him only warns Caldwell that we know. We need the Helena record first." "Helena takes 2 weeks. Which means," she said, "that in the next 2 weeks, Caldwell is going to apply pressure some other way. He can't let us wait quietly." She looked at Ethan steadily. "He's going to do something, and we have to be ready." Ethan nodded. He thought about the 3 families downstream. The Hendersons, the Bowers, the Olsons. He thought about them moving their cattle down through the corridor in autumn the way they had every year for more than a decade, the same way their fathers had. He thought about a man who would remove a document from a public record to take that away from them. He thought about Lillian Harper. Lillian Walker, who arrived at his gate 3 weeks ago with a suitcase and a dead man's letter, and who had in that time organized his accounts, built a correspondence with the Territorial Land Office, cultivated a source of information at the general store, gathered evidence from a neighbor's grandfather's letter, and identified the mechanism by which Victor Caldwell intended to destroy what Ethan had spent 7 years quietly surviving. I thought she didn't come here to be saved. And something in his chest, something that had been locked and quiet for a very long time, shifted. Not open. Not yet. But moving. That same evening before bed, he found her on the porch with the Henderson letter in her hand, reading it again in the last of the light. "You're going to win this," he said. She looked up. She said. "We're going to win it." He stood beside her and looked out at the dark pasture and the deeper dark of the hills beyond. "Samuel thought he was sending you somewhere safe," he said. "I know. He didn't know you'd end up in the middle of a land fight." "He'd have liked it," she said with a certainty that was entirely tender. "He always said the best way to know a person's character is to watch them when they have something real to fight for." She looked at Ethan. He looked back at her. "Well," he said quietly, "now we both know." The pressure Lillian predicted came on a Wednesday. Not from Caldwell directly. Not from Pruitt. It came through the one channel Ethan hadn't fully anticipated: the community itself, which was to say, the particular way a powerful man in a small valley doesn't need to threaten people openly when he can simply make the air around them uncomfortable enough that they start moving on their own. It started at the feed store. Ethan went in for a routine order and found that his credit account, which he'd held with Abel Morrison's operation for 11 years without a single missed payment, had been placed under review. Abel said it with genuine discomfort, not meeting. Ethan's eyes, using the words, "Just a formality," and shouldn't take long with the practiced vagueness of a man repeating instructions he was given and doesn't quite believe himself. Ethan paid in cash and didn't say anything that would make Abel feel worse than he already did. But he drove home with his jaw tight and his hands quiet on the reins, which was how Ethan Walker expressed a fury that a less controlled man would have spent across the feed store counter. He told Lillian when he got back. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "How much debt does Abel Morrison carry with the Millhaven Savings Bank?" Ethan hadn't thought about that. "I don't know. Victor Caldwell is on the bank's board of directors," she said. "I found that in the county records last week." She was already thinking ahead of the conversation. He could see it. He didn't threaten Abel directly. He doesn't need to. All he needs to do is make sure the right person mentioned the right thing in the right room and let Abel's anxiety do the rest. "He's isolating us," Ethan said. "He's isolating you," she said. "Which is what he's always done. He's used to people standing alone." She looked at him steadily. "That's why this is different now." I understood what she was saying. And he was beginning to understand something larger, that Victor Caldwell had studied Ethan Walker from a distance for years and had built his entire strategy around a version of Ethan that no longer quite existed. The isolated rancher. The man who carried everything alone. The man with no real allies and no one to fight alongside him. That man had lived here. Ethan could still feel the shape of him, like a coat he'd worn so long the lining had become familiar. But Lillian had been in this house for less than a month, and already that coat didn't fit right anymore. The following morning she drove to the Henderson farm. She didn't tell Ethan she was going. She took the small wagon herself, told Pete she'd be back before noon, and drove the 3 miles east without ceremony. Ethan found out from Pete, who delivered the information with the tone of a man who considers what a woman does with her mornings to be entirely her own business. She came back carrying 3 things. Clara Henderson's letter already in their possession, a written statement from Gus Henderson describing the history of the corridor access, going back 15 years, and an introduction to the Bauer family, who had agreed to meet with her at the Henderson farm the following Tuesday. She set these items on the kitchen table with the same matter-of-fact energy with which she set down the mail. "I also spoke with Reverend Alcott," she said. Ethan looked up from the harness he was mending. "Why?" "Because he's been in this valley for 22 years, and he performs the funerals, which means he has access to death records and estate records going back to the original settlement. If there are any historical documents that establish community use of the creek corridor, the church would have them." She sat down. "He's looking." "You organized all of this today." "This morning," she said. Pete, who was sitting in the corner pretending to sharpen a knife that was already sharp, said, "I like her." Ethan looked at his wife. She was already opening the Henderson statement and making notes in the margin. "Thank you," he said. She didn't look up, but her pen slowed for exactly 1 second before she continued writing, and that second was enough. The meeting with the Bauers happened on Tuesday as planned, and the Olsons came too. Word had traveled faster than Lillian anticipated, which she said afterward was because people in a small valley talk, and the question is only whether they talk toward you or away from you. Toward them, apparently. Because when Lillian laid out the situation at Gus Henderson's kitchen table, the missing survey, the land office inquiry to Helena, the Caldwell pressure campaign, the stake in the eastern pasture, the Bauer patriarch, a German immigrant named Heinrich, who had worked his land for 17 years, responded with precisely 4 words. "What do you need?" Lillian told him. She needed written statements from anyone who had used the creek corridor with Ethan's knowledge or permission. She needed dated records letters, any documentation that established the corridor as community access. She needed people willing to appear at a county hearing and say in person what they had written on paper. Heinrich Bauer nodded once. "My father wrote a letter to your husband's father in 1871. To thank him for allowing the access. I have it." The room went quiet. Lillian said, "Mr. Bauer, that letter is potentially the most important document in this entire case." "Then you should have it," he said simply. On the way home, Ethan was quiet for so long that Lillian finally said, "What are you thinking?" "That I've lived next to these people for 7 years, he said. "And I didn't know Heinrich Bauer had that letter. I didn't know any of it. I never asked." "You didn't know you needed to. I should have known anyway." He looked at the road. "You've known these families for 3 weeks." "I asked," she said simply. People share what they know when they feel like someone genuinely wants to hear it. She paused. You weren't unfriendly to them, Ethan. You just kept your distance. There's a difference. Not much of one from their side of it. She considered this. Maybe. But they came today. That means something. It meant something to him too, in a way he couldn't quite find words for the specific, unfamiliar warmth of understanding that you are not as alone as you believed yourself to be, and that the aloneness was at least partly a structure you built yourself and could perhaps take apart. The letter from Helena arrived on a Friday, 14 days after Herbert Fitch had sent the inquiry, which was faster than anyone expected, and which Herbert announced at Lillian's next visit to the county office, with a relief that confirmed to Lillian's mind that whatever his involvement in the missing document, his conscience had been troubling him about it. She brought the letter home, and they read it together at the kitchen table. Ethan, Lillian, and Pete, who had developed the habit of being present for all significant events, without technically being invited in the way of people who are simply indispensable and know it. The Territorial Land Office confirmed in the precise and formal language of official correspondence that a survey of the Walker property eastern boundary had been submitted and recorded in November of 1868, and that the record was intact in the Territorial Archive, and that the boundary as surveyed placed the entirety of the creek corridor within the Walker property by a margin of 32 feet. 32 feet. Victor Caldwell's stake, which Pete had gone out and measured after the fact, was planted 11 feet inside the Walker line. Pete said, he didn't miscalculate. He knew. He knew, Lillian confirmed. He was never trying to win a genuine dispute. He was trying to create one long enough to establish a legal claim he could leverage. She folded the letter carefully along its creases. He needed the county record gone, so the Helena confirmation would take long enough that he could move first. But we moved first, Ethan said. We moved first, she agreed. The plan Lillian proposed that evening was not what Ethan expected. He expected, because it was the practical thing, to take the Helena letter to a county judge, file a formal response to Caldwell's implied claim, and wait for the legal process to resolve it. That was the approach of a man who understands that patience in a legal matter is usually rewarded. Lillian did not propose patience. She proposed a public hearing, not because they needed one. The Helena letter and the community statements taken together were almost certainly sufficient for a straightforward judicial resolution. She proposed it because she had been thinking about something larger than the eastern 40 acres. Victor Caldwell has been doing this for years, she said. Not just here. The Bowers told me he pressured their neighbors, the Reedies, into selling their north parcel 3 years ago under similar circumstances. The Reedies' records were suddenly incomplete. Pruitt appeared with a generous offer. The Reedies were tired and they took it. She looked at Ethan. If we settle this quietly, he'll do it again. To the next family. The one after that. Ethan looked at her. You want to expose the method, he said. I want everyone in this valley to understand exactly how he operates, so that when he tries it again, the next family knows what they're looking at before they sign anything. She set her hands flat on the table. A public hearing puts everything in front of witnesses. The missing county record, the Helena confirmation, the Caldwell stake planted inside our boundary line, the community statements, all of it in open session on the record. He'll fight a public hearing, Pete said. He'll fight it hard, Lillian agreed. Which tells you something. Ethan was quiet for a moment. What does it cost us if it goes wrong, he said. If we can't demonstrate the missing record was deliberately removed, we just look like suspicious people. She was honest about it. He appreciated that the refusal to oversell the plan. But we have Fitch's own statement that the files were disturbed. We have the timeline of Pruitt's visits to the records office. We have the harness gift. None of that proves anything individually. But collectively, in front of a room full of people who've watched Caldwell operate for 20 years, it tells a story that doesn't need a verdict to be understood. Ethan looked at the Helena letter. He looked at the Bauer letter and the Henderson letter and Clara Henderson's grandfather document, all organized in Lillian's careful folder. He said, "All right." She looked at him. "All right," he said again. "Let's do it your way." The moment Caldwell learned they were requesting a public hearing, which happened within 48 hours, Because small valleys have short distances between ears, the response was immediate, and it was Douglas. Not Pruitt this time. Douglas rode out alone, which was either confidence or miscalculation, and tied his horse at the gate without waiting for an invitation, and walked up the path with the particular stride of a man who has decided that directness will accomplish what subtlety failed to. Ethan met him at the porch steps. Douglas stopped. He looked from Ethan to Lillian, who had come to stand in the doorway, and he made the decision to address Ethan. "This doesn't have to go to a public hearing," Douglas said. "My father is prepared to increase his offer to $150 an acre, and to include a water access agreement that benefits the Henderson and Bauer operations. Everybody wins." "Everybody wins," Ethan repeated. "It's a good offer, Walker. It's a better offer than the last one," Ethan said. "But you want to talk to me about good offers, you come out here after your men plant a stake 11 feet inside my boundary line. You send a lawyer in after someone walks out of the county records office with my survey documentation." He kept his voice level, not raised, just precise. "That's not a negotiation, Douglas. That's a man telling me he'll take what he wants if I don't sell it first." Douglas's jaw tightened. "That's a serious accusation." "It's a statement of fact," Ethan said, "which I'm going to make in front of a room full of people in 2 weeks. Douglas looked at Lillian. "Mrs. Walker," he said, and something in his voice shifted, not threatening exactly, but carrying the faint suggestion of a threat, the way a cloud carries rain. "You've been in this valley less than a month. You don't fully understand the relationships involved here. My father has been—" "Your father," Lillian said, "has been using the county records office as a tool for his own purposes, and we can demonstrate that." She came down one step. Just one. But it changed the geometry of the conversation. "I understand the relationships involved here quite well, Douglas. I've spent the last 3 weeks meeting the people in this valley and listening to what they've experienced. The Reedies, the Bowers, the Hendersons. I understand the relationships very clearly." Douglas stared at her. For a man who had grown up in a world where money moved people the way wind moves grass, reflexively without resistance, the experience of a woman standing on a porch step and refusing to move appeared to require significant processing. "You're making a mistake," he said finally, and it was the last weapon a man reaches for when the others haven't worked. "We've considered that possibility," Lillian said. "We're comfortable with our position." Douglas looked at Ethan one more time. Ethan said nothing. He didn't need to. He stood at the bottom of his porch steps beside his wife and let his silence be the answer, and it was enough. Douglas untied his horse and rode back the way he came. Pete appeared from the barn. "You two are going to give me a bad heart," he said. "You're fine," Ethan told him. "I'm not fine. I'm an old man watching a war get declared on his front porch." But he was almost smiling. "What do you need me to do?" "Drive Lillian into Millhaven tomorrow morning," Ethan said. "She needs to file the hearing request." Pete looked at Lillian. 8 o'clock, he said. 7, she said. The night before the hearing request was filed, Ethan found himself sitting on the porch later than usual, long after Lillian had gone in. The kind of late that belongs to a man working through something he can't resolve by working faster at it. She came back out. She didn't say anything. She sat down beside him in the other chair, the chair that had been empty for 7 years and which now seemed somehow to have always been intended for her, and she looked at the same dark she was looking at. After a while she said, "Are you worried? About the hearing? About any of it?" He was quiet for a moment, honest the way he'd promised himself he'd be with her. "I'm worried," he said, "about what happens if it doesn't work. Not to me, to the Hendersons, the Bowers. They've put their names on those statements. If this goes wrong, Caldwell will come for them next." Lillian was quiet. "I know," she said. "You knew when you proposed the hearing." "Yes." She didn't flinch from it. "I made that calculation, and I decided the risk was worth it, because the alternative settling, quietly letting him do this again and again to family after family, that's a worse outcome over time. But I won't pretend the risk isn't real." He looked at her. "That's the thing about you," he said. "What is? You don't make things sound easier than they are." He looked back at the dark. My whole life, people have either told me everything was fine when it wasn't, or told me everything was lost when it wasn't that either. You just tell me the truth, and then tell me what you think we should do about it." She was quiet for a moment. "My father was like that," she said. "He never lied to me about hard things. He said the kindest thing you can do for someone you respect is give them accurate information." He was right. He usually was. A pause. "Don't tell him I said that." Ethan almost laughed. Not quite, but close. He said after a while, "Lillian." "Yes, I want you to know something." He chose the words carefully, the way he did when he had something to say, and only wanted to say it once. "When you came here, I told you this was a practical arrangement, that I was honoring what your father asked." "I remember." "That's not entirely what it is anymore." The night held still around them. She said, "I know." "I'm not sure how to—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not easy company, I know that. And I don't have any practice at this." "At what?" "At caring about someone's opinion of me." He said it plainly, without drama. "I haven't cared what anyone thought about how I was doing in a long time. And now I find myself paying attention to whether I handled something the way you'd have handled it, wondering if I'm measuring up." He looked at her. "That's new." Lillian looked back at him. The moon was up, and her face was in partial light, and she looked in that moment like a woman who has been offered something unexpected and is deciding very carefully what to do with it. "You measure up," she said quietly. "You've been measuring up since you opened the gate." He didn't say anything. She stood up. "Get some sleep. We have a war to win." She went inside. Ethan sat in the dark for a while longer, listening to the land and the silence that was no longer quite entirely empty. In the morning, Pete drove Lillian to Millhaven, and the hearing request was filed with the office of Judge Harlan Beecham, who received it with the particular expression of a man who has spent 30 years in a jurisdiction and recognizes a significant occasion when one arrives at his desk. He set the hearing for 10 days out. Victor Caldwell's response arrived before the end of the business day. Gerald Pruitt filed a counter-petition claiming the hearing was premature and that the boundary dispute required additional survey work before any public proceeding could be meaningful. He attached a letter from a surveyor, a man based in Billings, whose name Ethan didn't recognize, stating that the 1868 survey was potentially in error and required modern verification. Lillian read it at the kitchen table that evening without changing her expression. "He's trying to delay," Pete said. "He's also trying to establish doubt about the Helena record," she said. "If he can get a current survey commissioned, one conducted by someone he controls, he can create a competing document." She set the petition down. "We have 10 days. "What do we do?" Ethan asked. "We find our own surveyor," she said. "One with no connection to Caldwell." She looked up. "And I write a letter tonight to every family in this valley that has ever had any dealings with Victor Caldwell. Because a courtroom is one thing, but a public hearing in front of 40 witnesses who have their own stories is something else entirely." Ethan looked at her. "I thought about the woman who had arrived at his gate with a suitcase and a dead man's letter, composed and proud, and carrying something he hadn't yet understood. He thought about every day since the ledgers, the letters, the kitchen table, the porch at night, the way she stood on that step in front of Douglas Caldwell and refused to move. He thought, this is what Samuel knew. Not just that she needed somewhere to go, but that she needed somewhere big enough for what she actually was." He stood up. "Tell me what letters to sign," he said. She slid the first one across the table without a word. He signed it. They worked until midnight, until the lamp burned low, and Pete had fallen asleep in his chair in the corner, and the stack of folded letters sat sealed and ready on the kitchen table, addressed to every family in the Eastern Valley. And somewhere in the Caldwell house, a man who had always won by moving first was about to discover what it felt like to be the one who moved second. The letters went out on a Saturday. Pete delivered them himself, driving the small wagon from farm to farm across the Eastern Valley with the quiet efficiency of a man who understands that some errands carry more weight than others and deserve to be handled accordingly. He was gone most of the day. When he came back, he sat down at the supper table and said, "Every one of them read it in front of me. Not a single one put it down without finishing it." Lillian looked up. Any who said no. None that said no, Pete said. Two that said they'd think on it, but the way they said it didn't sound like no. Ethan said, which two? The Whitfield brothers, North End. Pete reached for the bread. They've got a supply arrangement with Caldwell, lumber credit. They're scared of losing it. That's fair, Lillian said. She didn't sound disappointed. She sounded like a woman who had already accounted for the Whitfield brothers in her calculations. If they come, they come. If they don't, we don't hold it against them. Caldwell will hold it against them either way, Pete said. I know, she said. That's his problem, not ours. In the 5 days between the letters going out and the hearing, the pressure from Caldwell's direction intensified in the specific way that pressure intensifies when a man realizes his window is closing. It wasn't overt. Victor Caldwell was too practiced for overt. It was the kind of pressure that operates through suggestion and convenience, and the quiet withdrawal of small favors that people didn't know they depended on until they were gone. Abel Morrison's feed store extended credit again quietly, without explanation, which meant someone had told him to put the review aside. Ethan suspected that meant Caldwell had decided the feed store play had drawn too much attention and cut it loose before it became evidence. That was the thing about a man who had operated this way for 20 years. He knew how to retreat without appearing to retreat. But the surveyor Pruitt had hired showed up at the eastern boundary on Monday with 2 assistants and a new theodolite, and that was not subtle at all. Ethan found them there himself mid-morning when he was checking the fence line. 3 men he didn't recognize with professional equipment measuring and staking with the methodical pace of men who have been paid for a predetermined outcome. He stood and watched them for a long moment. One of the assistants noticed him and said something to the surveyor, a compact man in his 40s named Doyle, who walked over with his hands in his vest pockets and the practiced ease of a professional who has stood between 2 arguing parties before. Mr. Walker, Doyle said, I've been engaged by Mr. Caldwell to conduct a boundary verification survey. This is public access land, and the survey is within legal parameters. It's within legal parameters if the boundary is genuinely in dispute, Ethan said, which requires a formal filing I haven't seen yet. Mr. Pruitt filed the counterpetition 4 days ago. That counterpetition contests the hearing timeline. It doesn't establish a formal boundary dispute. Doyle looked at him with the mild surprise of a professional who has encountered an opposing party who has done his homework. Mr. Walker, you're welcome to conduct your survey, Ethan said. I'll be watching. He stood there the entire 3 hours. He didn't interfere. He didn't speak except to answer direct questions. He simply stood at his fence line and watched every measurement, every stake, every notation Doyle and his men made, and he memorized the position of every marker they placed, relative to the positions he already knew from the Helena record. When they left, he walked the line himself, measuring by pace and by memory, and he went home and wrote down every number he had. He gave them to Lillian. She compared them to the Helena survey dimensions for 20 minutes without speaking. Then she said, he moved the reference points. Ethan set down his coffee. Doyle, not obviously, not by enough to be immediately apparent. She traced a line with her finger across the Helena document. The 1868 survey used a specific rock formation as the eastern anchor point. Doyle's survey references a stake approximately 14 feet north of where that rock formation should be. If you run the boundary from his anchor point, instead of the original, the creek corridor falls outside your property by about 20 feet. Pete said, he manufactured a survey. He introduced a measurement error that benefits Caldwell, Lillian said carefully. Whether Doyle knows it's wrong, or was told to make it wrong, I can't say from this. She sat back. But our surveyor needs to be in front of Judge Beecham before Doyle's report is submitted. When does Doyle file? Ethan asked. Pruitt will time it for maximum impact. He'll file it as late as possible before the hearing, so we have minimum time to respond. She looked at him. We have 4 days. Their surveyor was a man named Arthur Greer, who came from the county seat and had been recommended by the same correspondent Lillian had used for her initial land law research. Greer was 61 years old, which looked like a liability until you understood that 61 years of survey work in the Montana Territory meant that Arthur Greer had personally conducted or reviewed approximately 40% of the boundary work in the entire region. He arrived on Tuesday and went directly to work. He was not a talkative man, which suited Ethan, and he asked precise questions rather than many questions, which suited Lillian. He found the rock formation that the 1868 survey had used as its anchor point in less than 2 hours. It was exactly where the original document placed it, which meant Doyle's reference stake was not an error of navigation, but an error of intent. Greer said this plainly, with the measured certainty of a man who has no stakes in the politics of the situation, and therefore no reason to soften his conclusions. The original anchor is unambiguous. He told them that evening, his notes spread across the kitchen table. Anyone competent enough to be hired for a formal survey would find it in the same time I did. Which means the alternate reference point in Doyle's preliminary is not a mistake. He looked at Ethan. I'll put that in my report. Will you say it in the hearing? Lillian asked. Greer looked at her. If I'm asked directly whether Doyle's reference point is a professional error or a deliberate misrepresentation, I will answer that question accurately. Thank you, she said. Greer nodded once and went back to his notes. Pete refilled his coffee without being asked, which was Pete's highest form of endorsement. The night before the hearing, Lillian couldn't sleep. Ethan heard her at 2 in the morning. Not the restless movement of the nightmares he'd noticed before, but something quieter, more deliberate. He heard her in the kitchen, and after 20 minutes, he got up. She was sitting at the table with the folder in front of her, not reading it exactly, more like confirming to herself that everything was in its place. The lamp was low. She was in her robe, her hair loose, and she looked for the first time since she'd arrived like a woman who was tired all the way through. He sat down across from her. She looked up. She didn't seem surprised to see him. I keep going through it, she said. Looking for what? Anything we missed. She turned a page. I can't find anything, but I keep looking. If there were something to find, you'd have found it by now. Probably. She closed the folder. I'm not worried about the evidence. The evidence is solid. She looked at him. I'm worried about the room. He waited. Victor Caldwell has been the most powerful man in this valley for 20 years, she said. He's been in that room, whatever room authority happens to occupy, for 20 years. Judge Beecham has known him for 20 years. She met Ethan's eyes. The law is on our side. The documents are on our side. But a room full of people has its own gravity. And I've seen what happens when a woman stands up in a room and contradicts a powerful man, even when she's right. Ethan looked at her. I understood what she was saying. Not fear exactly. Something more precise than fear, a clear-eyed recognition of how the world operated and the specific ways it could fail her, even when she had done everything correctly. You won't be standing alone, he said. I know. And you won't be the one contradicting him, he said. The documents contradict him. Arthur Greer contradicts him. Gus Henderson and Heinrich Bauer and Clara Henderson's grandfather's letter contradict him. He leaned forward slightly. You just arranged all of it. That's different. She looked at him for a moment. You've gotten better at this, she said quietly. At what? Saying the right thing. I've had a good teacher, he said. She almost smiled. Then something shifted in her expression. The tiredness still there, but underneath it, something steadier. My father would have liked watching you figure out how to do this, she said. What talk? Care, she said simply. He held her gaze. After a moment he said, Get some sleep. You've built something solid. Trust it. She nodded. She gathered the folder and stood. At the doorway she stopped. Ethan, she said. Yeah, whatever happens tomorrow, this was worth doing. Even if we'd had nothing but the Helena letter and the Bauer correspondence, it was worth doing. Because these people know now that someone saw what Caldwell was doing and said it out loud. She looked at him. Sometimes that's the whole thing, just saying it out loud. He watched her go. He sat in the kitchen a while longer with the low lamp and the folder she'd left on the table, and he thought about Samuel Harper, who had died knowing his daughter was capable of this, and still worried about her, because that's what fathers do. They see everything their children are, and still want to protect them from a world that doesn't always deserve them. He thought, I understand now, Samuel. I see her. All of her. Then he went to bed and slept better than he expected. The hearing room in Millhaven's County Courthouse held perhaps 50 people at full capacity. 73 showed up. Ethan knew the moment he walked through the door with Lillian on one side and Pete on the other, because he counted without meaning to the habit of a man who has spent years assessing livestock and landscape by instinct. 73 people in a room that wasn't built for them, standing along the walls crowded into the back, the overflow spilling into the hallway where the door was propped open. He recognized faces. Gus Henderson in the second row, with Thomas beside him and Clara at the end. Heinrich Bauer directly behind them, his wife, 2 of his sons. The Olsons. 3 families he knew by name, but hadn't spoken to in years. Frank Dutton, from the general store. Reverend Alcott, who had come with a leather folio that presumably contained whatever the church records had yielded. And the Whitfield brothers, both of them, in the 4th row. Pete noticed them at the same moment Ethan did, and said very quietly, "Well." Victor Caldwell was already seated at the respondents' table with Gerald Pruitt beside him, and Doyle the surveyor on Pruitt's other side. Caldwell was a tall man in his 60s, with the kind of face that had been handsome once, and had hardened into something impressive rather than warm. He didn't look at Ethan when they came in. He looked at Lillian. His expression did not change. But something in his posture shifted, a nearly imperceptible adjustment, the kind a man makes when he sees that the opposition has brought more than he budgeted for. Pruitt saw it too. He leaned and said something in Caldwell's ear. Caldwell answered without moving his lips much. Judge Harlan Beecham entered at 9 o'clock, and the room settled, not quickly but completely, the way a room settles when everyone present understands that what is about to happen matters. Beecham was 70 years old, and had the particular authority of a man who has seen enough attempts to manipulate his courtroom that he identifies them on sight. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the 2 tables. He looked at the documents already submitted to his clerk. He said, "This is a public proceeding. I will hear from both sides and from supporting witnesses. What I will not hear is disorder. Anyone who can't manage themselves quietly can find the door." Nobody moved. "Good," he said. "Mr. Pruitt, you filed the counterpetition. You go first." Pruitt's opening was polished. Ethan had to give him that. He was a skilled attorney, and he argued the delay petition with the smooth confidence of a man who has been in courtrooms all his professional life. He established the dispute. He raised the question of the 1868 survey's reliability, and he introduced Doyle's preliminary findings with the careful framing of a man presenting evidence rather than manufacturing it. Doyle took 20 minutes on the stand. How was professional and precise, and he presented his alternate reference point with the measured confidence of an expert whose work taken on its own terms was internally consistent. Pruitt sat down looking satisfied. Beecham looked at Ethan's table. Ethan said, "My wife will present our response, Judge." A ripple moved through the room. Beecham looked at Lillian. Pruitt was on his feet. "Your Honor, with respect, the matter of who presents." "Sit down, Mr. Pruitt," Beecham said without raising his voice. "I've heard arguments from wives defending family property in this room before, and I expect I'll hear more after today. Mrs. Walker." Lillian stood. She was composed in the specific way that she was always composed. Not cold, not mechanical, but present in a way that filled the space she occupied. She placed the folder on the table in front of her, and she did not look at Caldwell, and she did not look at Pruitt, and she spoke directly to Judge Beecham with the clarity of someone who has organized her thoughts so thoroughly that she no longer needs to reach for them. She began with the Helena letter. She walked through its confirmation of the 1868 survey boundary. She presented Arthur Greer's report, which she summarized accurately and succinctly, and she called Greer to the stand. Greer's testimony was 14 minutes long, and it was damaging in the particular way that expert testimony from a man with 61 years of experience is always damaging, not through drama, but through precision. When Pruitt cross-examined him and asked whether it was possible Doyle had simply made a professional error in selecting his reference point, Greer said, "Given the visibility and stability of the original anchor formation, I would say it is not possible for a competent surveyor to make that error accidentally." The room was very quiet. Caldwell's face did not change, but his right hand resting on the table closed slightly. Lillian presented the Henderson letter next, and then the Bauer letter, Heinrich's grandfather's correspondence from 1871, and walked Beecham through the timeline of corridor used these documents established. She called Gus Henderson, who spoke plainly and without embellishment about 15 years of seasonal cattle movement through the Walker corridor. She called Heinrich Bauer, who confirmed the history with the specific authority of a man whose family had written it down at the time. Then she presented the county record evidence. This was the moment the room changed. She laid out the timeline, the dates of Pruitt's visits to the records office, the state of the files as Herbert Fitch had described them, the fact that the 1868 survey record was absent from the county archive but intact in the territorial archive in Helena, and the timing of Doyle's commission relative to the hearing request. She did not accuse anyone. She presented the timeline and she let it speak. Beecham looked at it for a long time. He said, "Mr. Pruitt, I'd like to hear your explanation for the current state of the Walker deed file at the county records office." Pruitt stood. He had an explanation prepared. Ethan could see it in the set of his shoulders, the particular readiness of a lawyer who saw this coming. He said the records office was a historical archive with imperfect organization, that missing documents were a known challenge across many county offices, that there was no evidence of deliberate removal. It was a good answer. It didn't land the way he intended it to, because 40 feet behind him, Herbert Fitch was sitting in the 5th row with his hat in his hands and the specific expression of a man who has been carrying something too heavy for too long. Beecham looked at Fitch. Fitch stood up without being asked. "Your Honor," Fitch said, and his voice was not steady. "I need to say something." The room went absolutely still. Pruitt turned. Caldwell turned. Fitch did not look at either of them. "Mr. Pruitt visited my office 3 times in the last 2 months, Fitch said. "The 3rd time he asked me to locate the Walker deed file specifically. He examined it privately at the research table for approximately 20 minutes. He stopped, swallowed. I stepped away during that time. When I came back, he had replaced the file. I did not examine it to verify its contents were unchanged." Another stop. "I should have. I know I should have. And I accept whatever judgment this court—" "Thank you, Mr. Fitch," Beecham said. His voice was not unkind. "Sit down." Pruitt was on his feet. "Your Honor, this is an outrageous implication." "You'll have your opportunity to respond," Beecham said. "Sit down, Mr. Pruitt." The hearing continued for another hour. Pruitt did respond, and he was good at it, and he created enough legal ambiguity around Fitch's statement that the question of what had happened to the county record remained technically unresolved. But it didn't matter. Because the thing Lillian had said the night before turned out to be exactly right. The room had heard it. 73 people had heard Herbert Fitch stand up and say in his own struggling voice what he had allowed to happen, and no amount of legal precision was going to put that back in the box. Beecham ruled at the end of the session. He ruled that the Walker property boundary, as established by the 1868 survey and confirmed by the Territorial Archive, was valid and uncontested. He ordered the removal of all stakes placed outside that boundary within 72 hours. He ordered a formal investigation into the current state of the county deed records to be conducted by an independent party from the territorial government. He said before he closed the session, "This court does not take lightly evidence suggesting interference with public record documents. Anyone who believes they have relevant knowledge regarding that matter is encouraged to share it with the territorial investigator." He looked at Pruitt when he said it. Pruitt was writing something in his notes very carefully and did not look up. Caldwell stood when the session ended, and he looked across the room at Ethan with the expression of a man revising his understanding of a situation he believed he had fully mapped. Then he looked at Lillian. She was gathering her documents. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. Outside the Valley families, gathered in the way that people gather after something significant. Not celebratory exactly, but with the specific energy of people who have stood together in a room and come out the other side of it, still standing together. Gus Henderson shook Ethan's hand for a long time, without saying much. Heinrich Bauer shook it too, and then with the formality of a man who considers this more significant, shook Lillian's hand as well, which he clearly didn't do casually. "Your father raised a remarkable woman," he said to her. Lillian looked at him. Something crossed her face, not quite grief, not quite gratitude, something between the two. "He would have liked you very much," she said. Frank Dutton said he was buying coffee for everyone at his store, and most of the crowd moved that direction, which left Ethan and Lillian and Pete standing on the courthouse steps in a quiet that felt very different from the morning's quiet. Pete said, "That was something." "Yes," Lillian agreed. "Fitch," Ethan said. "I didn't expect Fitch." "I did," Lillian said. Both men looked at her. "He'd been carrying it since the day we came into the office," she said. "The way he told us about the disturbed files, that wasn't an accident. That was a man telling us as much as he could bring himself to tell us and hoping we'd take it from there." She looked at the courthouse door. He just needed to see that what he said would matter before he could say the whole thing. Pete shook his head slowly. "How do you know people like that?" "I pay attention," she said. She looked at Ethan. He was looking at her with an expression he hadn't worn in a very long time. Not just the openness of a man surprised by someone, but the deeper and more permanent look of a man who has located something he didn't know he was searching for, and is only now very slowly understanding what it means. "Let's go home," he said. She nodded. They walked to the wagon together, and Pete climbed into the back without comment, and Ethan took the reins, and the three of them drove out of Millhaven under a wide Montana sky, with the kind of silence between them that doesn't need to be filled because everything necessary is already understood. Halfway home, Lillian said, "There's still the territorial investigation." "I know," Ethan said. "Caldwell won't stop completely. He'll recalibrate." "I know that too." She was quiet for a moment. "But he'll recalibrate knowing we'll fight him," she said. "That's different. That's not the same valley he was operating in 6 weeks ago." Ethan looked at the road. "No," he said. "It's not." He reached over, not dramatically, not with any announcement, and he put his hand over hers, where it rested on the wagon seat. She looked down at his hand. She turned hers over and held it. They drove the rest of the way home like that without another word, while the shadows lengthened across the grass and the mountains turned purple in the distance. And somewhere behind them, Millhaven hummed with the aftershock of a story the valley would tell for years. The territorial investigator arrived 12 days after the hearing. His name was Edmund Carr, and he came from Helena with a letter of authority from the territorial governor's office, and the specific, unhurried manner of a man who has conducted enough official investigations to know that the most important information is never in the first thing anyone tells him. He was in his 50s, lean with gray at his temples, and the kind of eyes that recorded everything they passed over without appearing to. He went to Herbert Fitch first. Ethan knew this because Fitch sent a note to the ranch the morning after Carr's arrival, a short, careful note in Fitch's precise handwriting that said only, "The investigator asked me to recount everything in detail. I did. I thought you should know." Lillian read the note twice. Then she folded it and placed it in the folder with everything else because she kept everything. Because she had understood from the beginning that a story told in documents is more durable than a story told in memory. "Fitch is cooperating fully," she said. "Looks that way," Ethan said. "Caldwell will know by tonight." "He already knows." Ethan looked out the window. Man like that always knows. How was right. By afternoon word had traveled through Millhaven, the way word always traveled, not as a rumor exactly, but as a set of observed facts passed from person to person, with the gaps filled in by inference. Edmund Carr had visited the records office for 4 hours. He had examined the Walker deed file and 3 others. He had sent a writer to the Caldwell property with a formal request for a meeting. The writer came back with a message from Gerald Pruitt stating that Mr. Caldwell would be happy to cooperate with the investigation at his earliest convenience, which was a sentence that managed to sound cooperative while meaning approximately the opposite. Carr came to the Walker Ranch on the third day. He sat at the kitchen table and drank the coffee. Lillian sat in front of him and asked his questions with the patient economy of a man who has already formed a picture and is now checking it against the original. He asked about the timeline. He asked about Pruitt's visits to the records office. He asked about Doyle's survey and the alternate reference point Greer had identified. He asked Lillian how she had determined to request the Helena record. She explained it clearly without embellishment. The missing document, the disturbed files, the logical inference, the correspondence. Carr listened. He made notes. He looked at her with the particular attention of someone encountering a mind that works differently from most of the minds he interviews. "Mrs. Walker," he said, "how much legal training do you have?" "None formally," she said. He wrote something down. "How long have you been in this valley?" 9 weeks. He looked up. He looked at Ethan. He looked back at Lillian. 9 weeks, he repeated. Yes. He closed his notebook. He said, "I'll be submitting my findings to the governor's office within the month. I'm not in a position to discuss my conclusions, but I want you both to know that what you brought to that hearing was thorough. Genuinely thorough. In 20 years of this work, I've seen official investigations with less solid documentation than what you assembled." He said it plainly without flattery, which made it worth something. After he left, Pete came in from the barn. "Well," he said. "He's good at his job," Lillian said. "Good enough to get Caldwell." She thought about this. "Good enough to establish what happened clearly enough that Caldwell can't ignore it going forward." She sat down. "He may not face criminal consequences. Men like him often don't, not directly. But his method is exposed. The valley knows it. The territorial government knows it. And the next family he tries this with will have a much shorter path to stopping him." Pete absorbed this. "That's not entirely satisfying." "No," she agreed. "It's not. But it's real." She looked at Ethan. "Real is better than satisfying." Ethan nodded slowly. He had been thinking about this, about the gap between what justice looked like in principle and what it managed in practice, since the day of the hearing. He had wanted honestly something cleaner, something final. The part of him that had learned to survive by simplifying the world into what worked and what didn't, wanted a clear resolution, a definitive end. But Lillian had taught him something in the past 9 weeks quietly and by example, and it was this: that real fights, the kind fought with documents and testimony, and the patient accumulation of truth, rarely ended with the satisfying finality of a single decisive blow. They ended with a shift. A change in the landscape so gradual that you only recognized it by looking at where you were now and comparing it to where you'd been. Where they'd been was a man alone on a ranch that nobody challenged because nobody cared enough to. Where they were now was something else entirely. The shift in Millhaven happened slowly, and then all at once. It started with Frank Dutton, who had spent 30 years observing the valley from behind his general store counter, and who had apparently decided that what happened at the hearing represented a meaningful data point in his ongoing assessment of which way the valley was leaning. He began extending the same credit terms to the Henderson and Bauer operations that he'd previously reserved for the Caldwell account. He mentioned this to Ethan casually while Ethan was picking up supplies in the way that Dutton communicated most important things as a footnote to something unrelated. Ethan mentioned it to Lillian. She said, "I know. Clara Henderson told me yesterday." "You talk to Clara Henderson regularly?" "Every week," she said, as if this were obvious. "She knows everything that happens in the Eastern Valley before anyone else does. She's been the best source of information I have." Ethan shook his head slowly, not in frustration, in the specific wonder of a man still discovering the dimensions of the person he lives with. Reverend Alcott gave a sermon in early November that did not mention Victor Caldwell by name, and did not need to. It was about stewardship and about what a man owes to the land entrusted to him and to the neighbors who depend on the health of that land. Half the valley was in the pews. Several of the Caldwell ranch hands sat in the back row looking at the floor. 2 weeks after the hearing, the Reedy family, who had sold their north parcel to Caldwell 3 years earlier under circumstances that now looked considerably different, contacted Lillian through Reverend Alcott, asking whether anything could be done about their situation. Lillian spent a week going through the Reedy sale documents before she gave them an honest answer. She sat across from Thomas and Margaret Reedy at the Alcott house one evening and told them what she'd found and what she believed was possible and what was not. And she did not make it sound better than it was. And the Reedys listened with the particular dignity of people who have been wronged and have come finally to a place where someone will look at the evidence and speak plainly about it. The sale price was manipulated, Lillian said. We can likely demonstrate that. Whether you can reclaim the land is a different and harder question. But the sale terms there may be grounds for a compensation claim. Margaret Reedy said, "We don't want to fight. We just want what's fair." "Then let's find out what fair looks like on paper," Lillian said, "and we'll go from there." Ethan drove her home from that meeting in the dark and didn't say anything for the first mile. Then he said, "You know this is going to take months." "Probably longer," she said. "You're building a case for people who aren't us." "I'm building a case for people who deserve one," she said. "That's the same thing eventually." He drove in silence for another mile. "Your father," he said, "had no idea." She laughed, the real one, unguarded. "He had some idea. He just didn't know the scale of it." "Neither did I," Ethan said. "Are you complaining?" "No," he said. "I'm grateful." She looked at him. The words sat between them with a particular weight, not the politeness of gratitude, not the relief of it, but the genuine kind. The kind that comes when something you didn't know you needed turns out to have been essential all along. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah. I need to tell you something I should have said earlier." He waited. "When I came here," she said, "I told myself this was practical. I told myself I was doing what my father asked and securing a situation and applying my skills somewhere they were needed." She looked forward at the road in the lamplight. "I told myself that for about 3 weeks. And then I stopped being able to tell myself that." She said it simply, without drama, the way she said most things that mattered. "What this is, what it's become, I didn't plan for it. I don't think you can plan for something like this. I think it just happens when two people stop managing each other and start actually seeing each other." He was quiet for a moment. "When did you stop managing me?" he asked. She thought about it. "The night you came into the kitchen at 2 in the morning and sat across the table from me and didn't try to fix anything. You just sat there." She paused. "That's not a thing men usually do, not in my experience." "I didn't know what to fix," he said honestly. "I know. That's what made it the right thing." He pulled the wagon to a stop, not because they'd arrived anywhere, just because the conversation required him to not be doing something else at the same time. He turned to look at her. "I've been trying to find the right moment for this for about 2 weeks, he said, "and I've decided there isn't a right moment, so I'm going to say it on a dark road at 9 o'clock at night, because that's apparently when I'm capable of being honest about something I can't fix with my hands." She looked at him. "I love you," he said. "Not because of your father's letter, not because of what you've done for this ranch, because of who you are, which is the most specific and difficult and remarkable person I have encountered in my adult life, and I would like you to know that clearly." He held her gaze. "I know that's not the arrangement we agreed to." The night was very quiet around them. Lillian looked at him for a long moment, the focused inward look he knew now as the signal that she was taking something seriously, measuring it against everything she knew. Then she said, "Ethan Walker, the arrangement we agreed to stopped applying to me approximately 6 weeks ago. I've just been waiting for you to catch up." He absorbed that. "6 weeks," he said. "You're not a fast mover." "I know that about myself." "It's all right," she said. "You got there." She reached up and put her hand against his face, not tentative, not testing, just entirely certain, and he turned into it like a man turning toward warmth after a very long time in the cold. He said her name once quietly. She said, "Take us home." He did. December came to the Montana Territory with the particular seriousness that Montana December always brings, hard and bright and uncompromising, the kind of cold that clarifies everything down to its essential form. The ranch ran well. The cattle were in the winter pasture. The accounts were current. The eastern boundary stood exactly where the 1868 survey said it stood, and the territorial investigator's report had been submitted to the governor's office and was, according to Edmund Carr's final note to them, thorough in its findings. Gerald Pruitt quietly discontinued his representation of Victor Caldwell in the matter of the Walker property dispute. The Millhaven Grain Company reinstated Ethan's credit account without discussion. Abel Morrison at the feed store began greeting Ethan with the particular warmth of a man who is grateful that a test he was failing has been concluded. Victor Caldwell did not disappear. He was still the largest landowner in the valley. He still had money and influence and the structural advantage that both of those things confer. But he operated differently now, more carefully, more aware of the fact that the valley was watching with a different quality of attention than it had watched with before. He did not send Pruitt to any other rancher's property. He did not file any further boundary claims. He did not, as far as anyone could tell, make any further visits to the county records office. The Reedy compensation claim was filed in December through a lawyer in the county seat who had taken the case after reviewing Lillian's documentation. It would take time. Most things worth doing did. On a Saturday, in the second week of December, Pete Dobbins announced over breakfast that he was going to visit his sister in Butte for the holidays and would be gone for 10 days. He said this without asking permission, without explanation, and with the particular satisfaction of a man who has timed a thing well. Ethan said, "You don't have a sister in Butte." "I might," Pete said. He left that afternoon. In his absence, the ranch fell into the particular quiet of two people who are entirely comfortable in the same space and have stopped performing comfort and are simply living it. They worked alongside each other through the cold days, Ethan with the cattle and the physical maintenance of the operation, Lillian with the accounts and her correspondence and the ongoing Reedy documentation. And in the evenings, they sat by the fire and talked sometimes for hours, in the way that people who have been too long without real conversation drink it when they finally find it. She told him about her childhood. Not the sanitized version, but the real one, her mother's death when she was 14, the way her father had held the household together through sheer determined love, the years she'd spent being quietly more capable than any of her circumstances rewarded. He told her about the hard winter. The first time he'd tried to tell it to anyone had been to Samuel Harper years ago, and that had been incomplete. He told Lillian the whole thing. The animals he lost. His brother's voice during that last night. The specific way grief can calcify into something structural if you let it live in you long enough without being spoken. She listened the way she did everything completely. When he finished, she said, "You've been carrying that for 14 years, thereabouts. And you rebuilt all of this anyway." "Had to do something," he said. "That's not nothing," she said. "That's not close to nothing. A lot of men would have stopped." "A lot of men did stop," he said. "I didn't have anything else." "You had yourself," she said. "That was enough to start with. It just wasn't enough to finish with." She looked at him directly. "That's what my father understood. He knew what you'd built. He just knew you couldn't see what was missing." Ethan looked at the fire. "He was right," he said. "He usually was," she said. "Still insufferable." They both sat with that for a moment, with Samuel Harper, who was gone but present in this room in every real sense, who had written a letter at the end of his life and placed it in his daughter's hands and said, "Go to this man. Trust him. Let him trust you." And the weight of his absence was real, and the size of what he had set in motion was also real, and both of those things were true at the same time, without contradiction. "I want to plant something in the spring," Lillian said after a while. "What kind of thing? Something that takes years to grow, something that will be here long after us." She looked at the wall thinking. "An apple tree, maybe. My mother had one. She said the thing about an apple tree is that you plant it for your children, not for yourself. You never really get to eat the full benefit of a tree you plant." She looked at him. "I like that idea. Building something for later." Ethan looked at his wife. He thought about a man who plants an apple tree, who has for the first time in 14 years a specific and breathing reason to think about later. "We'll plant one in April," he said. "Wherever you want it." She smiled, the real one. Then she said, "Maybe two." The letter that changed everything arrived on a Thursday morning in the third week of December, and it came not from Edmund Carr, or the governor's office, or the Reedy lawyer, but from a woman named Margaret Ellison, who lived in Billings, and who was apparently the widow of the man who had conducted the original 1868 Walker property survey. She had read about the hearing in the county proceedings notice. Small newspapers printed all official proceedings as a matter of public record, and she had written to Lillian directly, which Lillian said later she must have determined was the appropriate address based on the detail in the notice. The letter said that her late husband, in addition to the survey itself, had kept a personal field journal from all his early work. She had been sorting his papers and had discovered the 1868 Walker entry. The journal contained detailed notes on the Anchor Rock Formation, the measurements, and critically a notation. Her husband had made 2 years after the original survey, when a neighboring party had attempted to dispute the eastern boundary, and he had gone back to verify his work. The notation confirmed everything. It also contained one more thing. Ethan read the letter twice. Then he handed it to Lillian without speaking. She read it. He watched her face as she got to the last paragraph, the part where Margaret Ellison wrote that her husband had noted in his personal journal that the Walker property eastern boundary as surveyed was one of the clearest and most defensible boundaries he had ever recorded, and that his one concern, noted and apparently forgotten, was that the isolation of the property's single owner meant there would be no one to advocate for its integrity if it were ever challenged. A man needs someone standing beside him. The surveyor had written in 1870 in a private journal no one had read until now. Without that, even the best boundaries are vulnerable. Lillian set the letter down. She looked at Ethan. He said, 62 years ago, a man we never met wrote that. Yes, she said. And now here we are. Yes. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Pete, who had returned from his non-existent sister's house in Butte 2 days earlier, came in from the barn and looked at them both and said, "What happened?" Ethan looked at him. "Nothing bad," he said. "The opposite." "So why do you both look like that?" Lillian folded the letter carefully. "Like what?" "Like someone just told you something true that you already knew." She looked at Pete. Then she looked at Ethan. I was looking back at her with the steady, open look that had replaced over the past 3 months the closed and careful expression she had seen the first day at the gate. Not guarded anymore. Not braced. Just present, entirely, unreservedly present in the life he had built and the life they were building together. "Write to Mrs. Ellison today," he said. "Thank her. Ask if she'd be willing to submit the journal page to the territorial investigation." "Already planning to," Lillian said. "And ask her if she'd like a copy of how it all turned out." Lillian paused. She looked at him. "Why?" "Because she took the time to write. Because she went through her husband's papers and found something useful and then sent it to a stranger." He picked up his coffee. "People who do things like that deserve to know they mattered." Lillian was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her pen. She wrote to Margaret Ellison for 20 minutes a letter. Ethan didn't read because it was hers to write, but which he could tell from the pace of her writing was not a formal acknowledgement, but a real one. When she finished, she sealed it and set it with the outgoing mail, and that was that. On the last day of the year, they stood on the porch together, not talking at first. Just standing in the dark and cold of a Montana December, looking at the land that had been a wound once and was now a home in every sense the word actually meant. Ethan reached into his jacket. He held out a small object, a pocket watch on a short chain. Old and dented, the kind of object that has been carried long enough to be worn smooth in all the places a hand finds it repeatedly. Lillian looked at it. "My father's," Ethan said. "My grandfather gave it to my father, and my father carried it from the day he settled this land until the day he died." He held it out. "There's an inscription inside. I want you to read it." She took it carefully. She opened it. The inscription read, "This land remembers who loves it." She closed the watch. She held it for a moment against her chest. "Ethan," she said, "I want you to have it," he said. "Not because it's worth anything. Because you're the reason this land is going to keep being what it was meant to be." He looked at her. "You're the reason I know what that means." She looked at him for a long time in the cold dark. Looked at him the way she always looked at things that mattered completely and without reservation. Then she put the watch in her pocket. "Your grandfather was right," she said. He was a smart man. So is his grandson. She stepped close, sometimes slowly, but reliably. He put his arm around. She leaned against him. And the land around them, the eastern boundary, intact and documented, and witnessed the creek corridor open for the valley's families, as it had always been. The apple trees not yet planted, but already decided upon the accounts. Current and the barn. Solid and the kitchen warm, with evidence of two lives braided together, held them in the particular silence that belongs only to a place that has found its people. Samuel Harper had known what he was doing. He had looked at a daughter who was larger than her circumstances, and a man who was smaller than his own goodness, and he had trusted with the unflappable faith of a dying man who has run out of time for anything but the essential truth that given the same roof and the same cause and the willingness to see each other clearly, they would find the way to the rest of it on their own. He had been right. The cowboy who had built a house and forgotten how to make it a home had found what he was missing. Not in land, not in victory, not in the resolution of a legal dispute that had cost them both more than they'd expected and given back more than either of them had thought to hope for. He had found it in a woman who arrived at his gate on a Wednesday with a suitcase and a dead man's letter, and the absolute unshakable refusal to be anything less than exactly who she was. And that at last was everything.